Hello again, this is Professor Watts, and today we're going to continue our discussion of entrepreneurship and profit maximization, and we'll take a look specifically at the monopoly market model. So first off, some basic definitions. Monopoly is a market in which there's a single producer of the product, and situations in which there really is only one producer of a product are actually somewhat rare. We do nonetheless see markets in which there is a single dominant producer that might have some degree of monopoly power, or we see situations where there's oligopoly, which is a market supplied by just a small handful of suppliers. Oligopolies can act as monopolies by forming a cartel, which is a formal organization of oligopolistic players that control output and price for a particular product. They act as a group monopoly, if you will. Now, one of my favorite examples is stadium food. Here's an example of the food stand at AT&T Stadium where the Dallas Cowboys play. And when I see these, my first reaction is, WTF? P, which is an economic term. It stands for why these food prices. Well, of course, the food concessions at the stadium are all performed by one company, which is licensed by the team, and they can easily exclude competitors, and they can prevent you from bringing in your own food or drink that you purchased off-site. They know they have a captive audience then, and then they'll act as a monopoly, raise price, reduce quantity, and you can be sure that this is acting in a profit maximizing fashion. If this weren't maximizing profits for the concession company and for the team owner, the stadium owner, they wouldn't do it. They would allow a more competitive situation. So this is profit maximizing action. A very obvious case of monopoly at work, raising prices, reducing quantity in order to maximize profits. When we think about why is a business able to get away with this, well, the answer is market power. Market power is kind of synonymous with monopoly power. It's defined as the ability to raise price above marginal cost without fear that other firms will enter the market. Well, that only happens in a non-competitive situation. If I'm selling a product at a price higher than cost and making fat profits in a competitive market, other entrepreneurs can eventually sniff that out, enter the market, and start shaving the price down to attract business for themselves. Remember, profits will be competed away in a competitive setting. Well, not so in monopoly. There's no entry of competitors to force prices down. Okay? So when you have market power or a monopoly position, you can keep price above marginal costs and average costs and earn monopoly profits indefinitely. Okay, so you can think of monopoly as the absence of competition. And remember, competition, we think about it as the ability of other firms to enter. Not necessarily the presence of other firms. That signifies competition. But what we really want to get at here is the pure ability of other firms to enter. What makes this stadium food a monopoly is that the team ownership can legally prohibit other vendors from coming in and selling food. Imagine if that weren't the case. You know, you go in there, you're an entrepreneur, I bet. You would think, wow, I could get some ballpark franks over at Kroger and some buns. I could get some pops and some Gatorades, take them in there in a cooler, and I could sell hot dogs for $4 and still make pretty good profits. Well, then someone else would say, I could sell hot dogs for $3. I could get some 6 packs of beverages and bring them in there and sell them for $7 or $5. I could sell bottled waters for $2 and still make profit. So you would quickly see an organization of a lot of other enterprises that would come in, bid these prices down to cost pretty quickly. Of course, try that, you won't even make it past the gates. And with the Dallas Cowboys AT&T Stadium, it is the case that the owner, Jerry Jones, owns the food concession company too. Okay? He's all about maximizing his profits. Let's talk about the effects of monopoly. The obvious one is higher prices. No competitive pressure. Monopolies raise the price if a higher price is profit maximizing. Now, when would a higher price be profit maximizing? We have some insight on this. We've talked about it. When do price increases increase revenue and profits when demand is inelastic? Remember, when demand is inelastic, you can raise price. Because demand slopes down, you will see some reduction in sales, but the price effect overwhelms the quantity effect. So the greater revenue you get from the higher prices dominates the lost revenue you get from the smaller quantity. So of course, the smaller quantity, just as law of demand at play. And then we get a deadweight loss of consumer surplus, which means less gains for consumers. Well, that's kind of by definition of having higher prices and lower quantity. Consumers aren't buying as much, so they're not getting as much benefit from consuming the product. Now, profit maximization for the monopolists, that profit max rule is the same as it's always been. You produce a level of output at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And I hope you remember that logic. If marginal revenue is above marginal cost, you keep on adding to production because the marginal unit's profitable. If marginal revenue is below marginal cost, you want to cut back on production because the marginal unit is not profitable. And you wind up at this point, MR equals MC. Here's where it gets tricky. For the monopolist, price is no longer given. Remember when we talked about the idealized competitive model, that was the price taker model. The price is just given out there, it's set in a world market, and the marginal producer is so small that he just can sell as much as he wants at that price without affecting it. Well, the monopolist is the entire market, so the monopolist gets to choose the price. So monopolists can raise price, of course quantity will go down. Monopolists can cut price, quantity will go up. What that means is marginal revenue does not equal price anymore. So now we have to find the marginal revenue function for the monopolist. We might know the marginal cost curve. Now we have to discover what the marginal revenue curve is in order to do this calculation, and then we'll proceed from there. Now, marginal revenue decreases for the monopolist as price increases. Why is that? Well, it's just the law of demand. If you increase price, you lose quantity. Now you're going to gain some revenue on the units that you sell for the higher price, but you're also going to lose some revenue because you've lost some sales. And that means that marginal revenue is not equal to price. In fact, marginal revenue turns out to be less than price. Here's a numerical example with a demand curve, and we actually have a function here. We have a listing of various prices and various quantities that will be sold, and then we calculate total revenue and marginal revenue on the basis of that. Okay, so we'll think about what happens to revenue as this firm cuts price from 16 to 14. At a price of 16, they were selling 2 units, right here. And when they cut price to 14, they're going to lose those $2 per unit on these 2 units. So they're going to lose 4. They're going to gain an entire extra unit of output, an extra sale. And on that unit, they're going to gain the whole 14, the new lower price of 14. So they get plus 14 minus 4. Marginal revenue is 10. And notice that marginal revenue is less. Marginal revenue here at 10 is less than price, which is 14. Okay. And this effect continues to be the same. As price continues to go down, marginal revenue continues to be less and less. And the rule is, for straight line demand curves, marginal revenue curve has the same intercept. It hits the price axis at the same point, but twice the slope. Let me go back for a moment to this elasticity concept. And a few minutes ago, I mentioned that you can raise price and gain revenue and gain profits if you're dealing with inelastic demand. So monopolists with inelastic demand curve can stand to raise the price considerably. As you can see in the right panel here, the competitive price is way down here at marginal cost, but the monopolist can raise it substantially because you've got a steep demand curve, a very inelastic demand curve, and therefore a very steep marginal revenue curve. So that means that price on the demand curve is going to lie far above the marginal cost curve. Over here, if you were dealing with elastic demand, it's not the case. Okay, here's competitive output right here where price equals marginal cost, but here's where MR equals MC, and the monopolist price on the demand curve is not that far above marginal cost. So you can already kind of start to think about, if you could monopolize a market, if you could monopolize a good, which kind of good would you want to monopolize? One with inelastic demand or one with elastic demand? Well, of course, you'd want to go for the one with inelastic demand. You have to kind of think about it this way. Goods with elastic demand are goods that consumers can easily do without. Goods with inelastic demand are goods that people cannot easily do without. There's no good substitutes here. So if you want to establish a monopoly, you want to look for goods that are inelastically demanded, goods that people can't do without. And then if you can establish a monopoly, you really can stand to increase price considerably and then establish a significant block of lasting profit. Lasting profits, because remember, monopoly means that it's not possible for other entrepreneurs, other firms to enter this market and compete. Okay, so now we can use our basic framework. We have the shapes of cost curves, which we remember from last time. We have the profit max rule, MR equals MC. And the thing we've just added, which is the fact that for the monopolist, the marginal revenue curve is steeper than the demand curve. Same intercept, twice the slope. So we can graph everything out, and we can start to practice with this framework and think about the results of monopoly. So there's a demand curve. There's marginal revenue, same intercept, twice the slope, falling faster than demand as price changes. Marginal costs is a typical upward sloping shape, supply curve. Now there's our profit max point, MR equals MC. But notice at that point, people are going to pay the price on the demand curve. So price is set well above marginal cost. Remember, that's a feature of monopoly. Price is way above costs. And there's a permanent locked-in profit. So there's a monopolist's price. There's a monopolist's total revenue. Now, of course, to calculate profits, we need to find total revenue minus total cost. To find total cost, we'll draw the average cost curve back in here. And the average cost at this level of output, at the monopolist's level of output, is going to be right here. So that means total cost is just that times quantity. And then profit, remember, is total revenue, which would be this blue rectangle, minus total cost, which is this light purple rectangle. So there's profit right there. And you see that there's fat profits, and they're locked in profits because it's a monopoly. Competitors, even if they sense that this company's making profits, even if they know this company's making profits because they read its financial statements, they are prevented from jumping in and competing in this industry. That's what monopoly means. It's impossible, or extremely difficult at least, for other firms to compete. Consumer surplus is relegated to the small area here, above price, below the demand curve. And note that in a competitive market, now what would a competitive outcome be? Competitive outcome would be that we price at marginal cost. So competitive outcome would be way out here, and where the demand curve meets marginal cost is where we were when we were graphing competitive markets. And the quantity would be much larger, the price would be much lower. I've labeled that price competitive. And we lose this amount here that would be consumer surplus. It would be consumer gains. It would be the consumers buying more at a price less than their valuation here on the demand curve, but that doesn't happen. And that's the main reason that we are unhappy with monopoly. It's not necessarily because they make fat profits. These fat profits are a gain for the monopolist. They're a loss for consumers, but they're a gain for the monopolist. So this is just a transfer from consumers to producers. It's not a gain that doesn't happen. Now, you might be kind of ticked off if you're a consumer, but the producers are happy here. But the real reason we're unhappy with monopoly is right here, these deadweight losses. These are gains that nobody gets.
So you get nothing. You lose. Good day, sir.
These are potential gains that just don't happen because we're in a monopoly world and not a competitive world. All right, so there's the main problem of monopoly, this deadweight loss of total surplus. Now, the problem is especially evident where monopolies are caused by legal restrictions on competition, legal barriers to entry, where there are either laws or various other kinds of government policies that prevent competition from taking place. These are the especially pernicious ones. In other cases, monopolies might be viewed as the second best solution or the only feasible solution. But if it's a law that's preventing competition, then that's a needless prevention of competition. Let me give you some examples of that where you have monopoly by dint of a government grant of legal privilege. The U.S. Postal Service is maybe the classic example. It's actually laws that protect the Postal Service from competition in first-class delivery, which is a door-to-door delivery of letter mail. There's a little known incident in which you might call him a libertarian or classic liberal economist, Lysander Spooner, actually set up a rival postal company in the 1840s because he was opposed to monopoly, and he thought that he could outcompete the Postal Service because it's an inefficient government bureaucracy. And he actually succeeded for a few years. The Postal Service sued him, took him to court, and had him shut down. He was actually undercutting the prices for first-class mail delivery. Now, what are the losses of the Postal Service monopoly? They exist. I don't think they're that large. Fortunately, we have the benefit of competition in parcel delivery. So you have UPS, FedEx, DHL, etc., making the parcel delivery industry much more competitive and dragging price down to cost. Also made less and less relevant by the rise of email and other electronic communications. But nonetheless, you have the Postal Service. It's an official government monopoly, so it's generating some deadweight loss. The British East India Company is a famous historical monopoly. Britain in the colonial days was pretty famous or notorious for establishing monopolies of trade in its various colonies, preventing the ships of other companies or other countries from coming in and offering competitive rates on shipping. And so the British East India Company made monopoly profits in this lucrative trade of bringing products back from the East Indies. Here's another one that's still with us, state lotteries. You'll notice that there's only one lottery operator in each state. It's a monopoly. It's legally established. It's got a charter from the government. It's allowed to sell tickets and run a lottery. And remember that monopolies see permanent profits and higher rates of profit than competitive industries. In competitive industries, profit rates are competed down to where they're pretty much in the long run not going to be much larger than interest rates. What's the profit rate for the Texas lottery? I did look up the data on this, and I noticed that prizes equal only 60% of sales. That's pretty telling. It tells us that there's 40% of their sales that they're keeping. That's a pretty fat gross margin. You know, some of that's overhead. They have to have some administration. They have to process tickets and so on. They have some transportation costs, some advertising costs. But I did look up I looked up their financial statements, and I found that their profit, now it's technically a non-profit industry, but what I'm talking about here is their net income so what we would normally call profit, is about 30% of revenue. That is a fat profit rate. If you've ever been in business yourself, you're drooling right now at a prospect of profits being 30% of revenue. That's huge. And if we had competition in lotteries, would another business set up shop and say, hey, we have a better lottery? Our prizes are 70% of sales. Our prizes are 80% of sales. Our prizes are 90% of sales. Sure. Then that profit rate would get bid down until it's maybe like 5 or 10%, which is something more along the lines of the opportunity cost of capital. But because there's only one, and legally only one allowed, they can charge higher prices, give out fewer prizes, and permanently earn this fat level of monopoly profits. Now, let me just mention here, I'm not taking a policy stance on this, although I am pro-competition. The state governments do like having their monopoly lottery revenue because the state government is the ultimate beneficiary of this. So, and I'm not a big fan of lotteries anyway. I like the expression that lotteries are simply a tax on people who are not good at math. Okay, so recall our problem of monopoly is the deadweight loss of total surplus because they raise prices and reduce quantity. But here's the catch. Sometimes, because of problems of cost structures or incentive structures, monopoly is actually a best case scenario. In other words, in some cases, if we didn't have monopoly, we might not have production of the good at all. So in some cases, we're stuck with monopoly. We need to learn to live with it, learn to appreciate it. So here's two examples of that. The first is intellectual property. This has to do with patents and copyrights. A patent, which is exclusive ownership of really an idea, an invention for a specified period of time, was actually created by governments to give incentives for people to come up with new inventions and new ideas and advanced technology, even though we know that this is generating monopolies. So we're kind of saying here, well, we'll give people monopolies, and we know monopoly's not good, but if we can, through the course of giving people monopolies, and they're term limited, we get a lot of new ideas and new technology, maybe it'll be worth it in the long run to give people monopolies in the short run. Patent holders have a prospect of earning monopoly profits on their idea or invention, at least in the short term. So Apple, with the iPhone and various other products, has thousands and thousands of patents protecting all of its unique features and designs and softwares and whatnot. Coca-Cola Company has a patent on the unique design of its iconic bottle. And one of my all-time favorite patent holders, that's right, Michael Jackson, who actually held a patent on what was called the leaning shoes. It's actually a really clever bit of stagecraft that enabled him to lean past the center of gravity in that famous dance routine. Now, did we really need to have a patent for Michael Jackson to come up with the leaning shoes trick to enhance his already pretty spectacular dance moves? Well, maybe not, but in other industries, patents maybe have been relevant to create incentives for businesses to invest in the development of new technology that might not otherwise have happened without the prospect of patent protection, without the prospect of a temporary monopoly and the ensuing monopoly profits to be had. One example is the prescription drug industry. They have huge fixed costs of research and development, and a lot of the prospective drugs fail, and they have to recoup the cost for both the successful and failed drugs with the sales of the successful drugs. So they have to be able to charge pretty high prices, at least initially, for the first several years, maybe 10 years, in order to recoup their R&D costs. And they wouldn't be able to do that without patent protection, because if there was pure open competition for drugs, as soon as a company went through the expense of developing a drug, other companies could just acquire the pills, reverse engineer them, analyze the chemistry, and then produce copies at very low cost, because the imitator companies, they don't have to pay the high fixed costs of research and development. They just have to pay the pretty low marginal cost of popping out pills, of synthesizing the pills. So as a case in point, we have GlaxoSmithKline with their prescription drug Combivir, which is an anti-AIDS drug. And this and other drugs were very effective in reducing the death rate from AIDS. Now, of course, GSK owns the patent on the drug, and therefore they're in a monopoly position with this drug. The price per pill is about 25 times above marginal cost, exactly as we would expect. Proof of their market power: in India, the GSK patent is not enforced. You get imitation Combivir for 50 cents per pill, which is about the marginal cost. Now, if there was no patent protection in the US, would GSK have bothered to go through extensive and costly research and development for a drug that may or may not pan out? Well, the economic argument here is that no, they might not have done so. Not only would we not have Combivir at a price equal to marginal cost, we wouldn't have Combivir at all. And note that patent terms are limited. In the US, patents only last for 20 years. And prescription drug companies might not even get the benefit of the full 20 years because the patent would be granted at a time at which the drug is still going through its trial and approval process. So the company might only get 10, 15 years worth of patent protection. Is it worth it to get this kind of innovation? Arguably, yes. But I do want to note that there are some prospective alternatives to patents that could reduce deadweight losses of monopoly without destroying profit incentives that monopolies provide. And specifically, we can think about patent buyouts and prizes. Here's how patent buyouts work. The government basically, after a company has successfully patented a device or a prescription drug or an invention, what have you, something that's really socially beneficial. So let's say a prescription drug that could benefit millions of people with a particular disease or condition. The government just buys the patent for whatever its capitalized value is and then destroys it, rips it up, and then declares that the market for producing this good is open to all comers. So you now create a competitive market where price is going to quickly collapse to marginal cost, and you have quantity increase, you get back all the consumer surplus, you eradicate the monopoly profits. The downside is that you have to levy taxes in order to have the government buy the patent out, and taxes also create their own deadweight losses. What's the right price? Of course, firms that own these patents are going to argue for much higher prices, and because of lobbying, they might get the government to pay higher prices than they actually are worth, even as a monopolist in a competitive asset market. There's always the risk of corruption when we talk about the political system making deals and transferring assets. So those are some considerations, but I think patent buyouts are a idea that's worthy of consideration, and they're not getting as much attention as they should. I think they're kind of a middle road between the downside of patents due to the monopoly problems, but the upside of patents, which is the increased incentives for innovation and new technology that they generate. One of my favorite economic tools is the prize. And this is a little known phenomenon that I also think is worthy of more attention from economists. You might recognize this character here, Charles Lindbergh, famous aviator who was the first to cross the Atlantic nonstop. He was doing so in pursuit of a prize. In 1919, Raymond Ortigue, who was an international hotel tycoon, very wealthy man, offered $25,000. Now that seems like a paltry sum, but if we adjust that for inflation, that's at least $350,000 in today's money. So it's not an insubstantial sum of money. And that was going to be awarded to the first person to fly nonstop from New York to Paris. Lindbergh was not the only person pursuing this prize, and several crews attempted it, several pilots, several planes crashed, several men died. But Lindbergh was successful, and he had a really unique design here with a small plane, one pilot. The whole plane was basically a gas tank. This was state-of-the-art aeronautics at the time. And this really was beneficial to the world because they made some great strides in aircraft design and technology. Prizes are still with us, or at least have been recently. A recent example is the Ansari X Prize, which was a $10 million prize for a spacecraft that could be launched, orbit, and return to Earth, and then be prepared to reorbit within, I think, 2 weeks. And this Spaceship One, which is privately developed, actually performed this feat in 2004 and won the $10 million prize. And the X Prize, I should mention that X Prize Foundation is continuing to offer these kind of prizes for all kinds of different technological breakthroughs. So for those who are worried about the monopoly aspect of patents and the downside of that, one thing to consider is increased use of prizes.
Okay, so one last thing we need to mention here is the idea of natural monopoly, which arises from economy of scale.
And an example of this is utilities. They have high fixed costs, and therefore governments often allow a monopoly, or actually run the monopoly, to allow the utility to generate profits high enough to cover those high fixed costs. And if you think about this, it would be really unfeasible to have competition with many different providers if each had to have its own distribution network. Then that's the source of the fixed costs here. So you think about your electric power utilities. They have high fixed costs in both plant generating capacity and the distribution network. So it really is only feasible often for one producer to own the entire market in order both to create a sufficient network size and to be able to be ensured it can charge a price high enough to cover those costs, mostly fixed costs. This is designated a natural monopoly. In these cases, a monopoly can actually provide lower costs potentially than a multi-firm competitive market. And to realize why, you think about, well, small firms in electrical generation, small firms might be neighborhood generating associations, or maybe large industries would have their own power plants, but you'd have a lot of duplication of both capacity and transmission networks. So you'd have higher cost curves for small firms because they wouldn't be able to take advantage of economies of scale. So you'd have the average total cost curves for all these small firms looking like this, and the minimum cost for them would be at this level here at the bottom of these overlapping average cost curves. Whereas if you allowed one huge utility to operate for the whole market, this can be entire regions, entire states even, you have a much lower average cost curve. Even if you don't get to the minimum point of that average cost curve, you're at a much lower point than the minimum of these small firm average cost curves. All right, so you've got the monopoly operating here at actually a more efficient cost and pricing level than small firms could hope to achieve. Even if you're at this monopoly condition where, because MR is below demand, your monopoly quantity here at MC equals MR, leading to this monopoly price, higher than it could theoretically, ideally be in an optimal market situation, which would be out here, but better than the actual alternative. In economics, we're interested in feasible alternatives, not necessarily idealized theoretical alternatives. So that's natural monopoly. Now, another source of monopoly that we'll consider is the ownership of a unique asset or input. What do these people have in common? They earn large incomes because they've got unique assets that are very hard to replicate. Okay? In some cases, it's a face or an athletic skill or some kind of persona, some kind of unique knowledge. And all of these we might kind of just generally designate as talents. So these people here have unique talents, and they earn large incomes based on using those talents. Now, are they earning a price above minimum average cost? Although it's hard to establish what their minimum average costs are, we could argue, yes, these people are earning in the multi-millions. Now, is this a problem? I'll go ahead and argue, no, this isn't a problem for society. These high incomes are necessary to allocate these people's talents to their most highly valued uses. They're not necessarily needed to get these people to use their talents at all. But these are highly productive people, and that's simply reflected in their large incomes, despite the fact that they're technically monopoly incomes. And let's go back to a concept that we can apply here, which is the idea of rents. And it's very clear in this situation. Monopolists are earning rents. They're earning above market return that can't be competed away like profits can. Remember, I pointed out that LeBron James is earning $24 million a year, although he might play basketball for only $100,000 because he likes doing that and he's good at it and he wouldn't want to do a different job. Okay, so most of his income is rent. Monopolists earn rents. And in the case of companies where we could have competition, monopolies and rents are inefficient. But in cases of these unique assets here, where there's only one LeBron James, there's only one Brad Pitt, there's only one Martha Stewart, it's kind of unfeasible to have competition. And so we'll accept the fact that these people, because of their extremely valuable talents, they're going to be earning rents. Okay, so in conclusion, we can say that monopoly should be avoided if possible. And if we can have competition, we should go ahead and have it. So those artificial sources of monopoly, like the postal service or the lottery, are maybe the inefficiencies that we could do without. But in some cases, such as natural monopolies or highly talented individuals with unique assets, that's maybe a natural monopoly for which the alternative is not having a market at all.